Welcome to Vision Chats at Johns Hopkins, where the only thing that matters in the next hour is the future. Superhero Day. Woohoo! Welcome, Chris, and welcome everyone. Chris, you and I have been friends for a long time. It's been 2 decades since we've
Yeah,
known each other. And boy, the world has changed in the last 2 decades. We're so excited to have you today. And you've done a lot in the last 2 decades. So let me just tell everybody who you are in just
sure.
a quick minute. You're a professor, a researcher, you're an author, you've written children's books, you have a podcast, you speak about issues of race and gender bias and diversity and inclusion. You specialize especially in the area of media and film and Hollywood. You consult with a bunch of companies in media and one of them is Pixar, but there are a bunch of other ones. And your TEDx talk about bringing back the female superheroes, you really caught a lot attention of a lot of people and I don't know if you caught on the trend at that point or you called it or you started the trend, but I feel like ever since your TEDx talk, I'm starting to see more female superheroes and more diversity since then. So maybe some credit to you too, maybe a lot of credit. And you speak with a lot of passion about these issues. And the reason I wanted to bring you on today is because I care a lot about these issues too. But I also, I'm in the life design business, and I feel like one of the major components of people to design their lives is to see themselves in the future and to see themselves in role models that look like them, that represent them, and that has been missing for a long time. So let me just start where we should start, and tell us a little bit about your favorite superhero growing up, and then maybe how that got you on your journey to where you are today.
Sure. Well, number one, thanks for inviting me on. I think this is going to be really fun today. Um, as Dr. Day, as Farouk said, he and I go way way back. Yeah, we've been knowing each other for about 20 years now, and in those 20 years, the world has changed significantly. Um, what was my favorite superhero growing up? Wow. So honestly, I think, and even till today, I was always a Daredevil kid. I like Daredevil a lot.
Okay.
I read a lot of Daredevil when I was a kid. I really liked Daredevil, but I'm also really big into the X-Men. And X-Men always kind of spoke to me as a kid because X-Men is really the story of what it means to be an oppressed person, what it means to be an oppressed people, an oppressed group of people, and how we go about dealing with our rights. And it struck me as, even when I was a kid, it struck me, that it was weird to me that the X-Men villain was Magneto, because Magneto wasn't opposed to what the X-Men were trying to do. I think both of them were stories of what it means to be oppressed, right? And on the one side, you have Charles Xavier saying, hey, let's work within the system and we'll get our rights together and we'll try not to make people afraid of us or whatever. And then on the other side, you have Magneto who's like, hey, guess what, cousin? My rights aren't yours to give me. They're mine. And I'll take them from you if I have to. And you don't get to oppress me. I am more powerful than you. You don't get to oppress me. And those two things, that struggle was happening inside my own head, which which made for interesting reading when you empathize with both sides, both who are supposed to be the heroes and who's supposed to be the villain, and you're like, actually, you're both right. And so, that was really my big superhero text, and I think in many ways, kind of the X-Men kind of put me on the path of examining media really closely that built the entire rest of my career.
Hmm. And there you are today. Well, I will tell you. So I have Moana as a background, and
Mm-hmm.
that has become my new favorite superhero.
Moana's great.
Thanks, thanks to my yeah, and I've watched it so many times with my now 5-year-old daughter, and she's everything that I feel like that my daughter can be. She's brown, she has curly hair, she's courageous, she's brave. She's we're beach people. I certainly am, so that's why also I gravitated towards that movie. But when I think of growing up, I really loved Superman, who was everything that I could never be. He could fly, I could never fly. He had blue eyes, I don't have blue eyes. He's
Right.
this big white guy, I'm not. So I'm so happy to start to see this major change now, and there's still a lot of work to do to get more representation there. So there was a moment there where were you catching a trend? I felt like when you started to speak about these things, or at least when we started to hear about you speaking about it, it felt like that was a moment where the industry started shifting, and all of a sudden I started to see more characters representing diversity out there. You know that world a lot better than most of us. So tell us, like, what was happening in Hollywood and in animation at that point?
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't say that like I wouldn't say I was responsible for that. I think that'd be a fairly ridiculous and egotistical sort of post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of a thing to say. But I do think that I was able to crystallize a moment that was already happening. People were fed up. People were mad. There was a lot of hashtag war going on when my TED Talk hit the scene, because people were mad about the Avengers, and people were mad about Guardians of the Galaxy, and people wanted not more female superheroes, because there are plenty of female superheroes. I mean, there are plenty of female superheroes in the world and in comic books, but that wasn't translating to going to the store and being able to buy stuff to play with. And yes, it's a very first world problem. I get that, but on the other hand, you know, toys are the way kids make sense of the world.
Right.
Toys are the way kids make sense of the world. Dressing up and play, kids make sense of the world through play. Play is very, very important to childhood. And when people try to minimize the impact that toys have on children, it lets me know they don't know very much about kids. Because you can't go to a kid and say, hey, here's this really awful thing that's happening, process that with me, let's talk it out, blah, blah, blah. Kids won't do that. They don't have the cognitive and emotional ability to do that. But a kid will take two toys, and you can know everything that's going on in a child's life by watching them play and hearing the stories they create, and how those toys, if they're mad at their mom or whatever, this toy is going to be mad at this toy for a very specific reason, and you can watch that unfold in their play. So what toys we give them to play with matters immensely for how they begin at these very formative stages to make sense of the world. So the fact that these female superheroes weren't appearing in toys in a very real way is teaching both little boys and little girls that girls don't get to be superheroes, that all the superheroes are boys, and by extension that all heroes are boys, and by extension that women and girls are not heroes. And so as the father of a daughter, who is, you know, one of my very favorite people who has ever existed in the history of the planet, I wanted her to be able to play with stuff that made her feel as though her contributions to the world are important and are valued and are heroic independently of gender. And the only way to do that is to have an equal number of boy superheroes and girl superheroes to balance that out, so that the gender doesn't matter. Because when it's only one gender, then the gender matters immensely. And yes, recognizing that gender is a spectrum, and that there are more than two genders, and lots of other sort of constructs around that, but not in terms of media production. In media production, there are two genders, which is why you don't see trans people in a lot of stuff, because we live in a very black and white, get in your box kind of media culture. So there are only two genders. So if there's only two genders, and then all we ever give you is one gender, it literally erases the other gender. And so that made me really angry. So I had this really beautiful opportunity to get up and to talk as a father and as a scholar about the nature of marginalization of female superheroes. And again, while I don't think I was, you know, responsible for the industry, you know, moving in a different direction, I do think it lit a fire. I know for a fact it lit a fire under some very specific people. When I started working at Pixar, for example, one of the first things that, you know, the woman I was working with at the time told me was she had shown her she had shown my video to John Lasseter, who was the president of the founder of Pixar at the time, and he had shown it to Bob Iger, who is the president of NBC Universal Comcast, the biggest media corporation in the world, and they own Marvel. So, you know, I mean, I know I very specifically spoke to some very powerful people through that TED Talk, which then got me invited to come talk live to a lot of really high-powered people, and that's where I started doing my consulting work in the industry. So, yeah, it really was a domino effect to some extent, but yeah, I wouldn't say I'm solely responsible for it. That would be ridiculous, but I do think I played a role, and that's all I wanted to do.
And that got you to the table essentially. So I mean, you're speaking to
Exactly.
these people, and you were at the table, and then you probably started to learn and realize certain things about the industry and how people think that you didn't even know before.
Absolutely.
Uh, Invite us into that. Like, well, what did you learn at that point? What you started to talk to all these people? What did you hear? What did you learn? How is the industry changing? Bring us into that world a little bit.
I think the most important thing that I learned is that there is no they. Like when I started doing this work, the entire time I have been, really my entire career, and when I talk to just regular people who don't work in the industry a lot, there's a lot of, well, they're doing this and they're doing that, and why do they think this? And the most important thing that I learned was that there is no they. When you go and you sit in these rooms with these people, they are wonderful, amazing, creative people. They are just trying to tell good stories. They are just trying to, do the best that they can to put something nice into the world. They're artists. And the problem with that is that they are replicating, there's no such thing as outside of culture. They were brought up in the same culture that we were. And so the stories that they tell and the way they tell them are just replicating the stories that they were told when they were kids. So that's what they think. Well, I was told this great story when I was a kid, so I'm going to tell the same kind of story now. And when you talk to them and you begin to point out the ways in which maybe the stories you're telling are a problem for different groups of people, or you're not really portraying them correctly, or the stories that you're telling are leaving people out or whatever, they're horrified. They're really taken aback, and they're very receptive to. I have never been in a meeting with someone where I have said, here's a way that this could be interpreted, and that's gonna make some people feel bad when this movie comes out. I've never said that out loud in a meeting in the last 3 years where someone in that room didn't go, oh my God, we have to change that. I've never said. So the problem isn't that there's no set of 5 white guys sitting around a table like, let's ruin everything. That's not how it works. It's just people trying to tell stories and do the best they can. And when you point stuff out to them, one-on-one, person to person, they hear it, they figure it out, and they change it. Which means the problem isn't in the stories. The problem is in who gets to tell the stories. The problem is in who's in the room where it happens, so to speak, Hamilton reference. But it's who's in the room where it happens, right? I'm now in the room where it happens. I get to point that out, but I'm only one person. So what the industry needs is not more directors, it's not more producers, it's not more writers, it's more me. And that's why the work that I do with my students is so important, because I'm trying to build this next generation of culture consultants, of culture executives who can sit in those rooms and who can say, here's what we're actually saying if we put this on screen. Here's what we're actually saying if we put these toys out. Here's what we're actually saying if this is the way this video game looks. That to me is the biggest eye opener, because I always thought it was the directors, it was the producers, it was the writers who really needed to change how they were operating and who they were. And yes, it's going to be great to get more women and more people of color into those positions, but it's also going to be great to get more women and people of color just into the rooms in general, in places where they can say the kinds of things that nobody has been saying for a really long time, ever, really.
Yeah. And representation is so important, and without representation in the room, then it's easy to miss the opportunity to empathize,
Right.
which sounds like is the experience that you've had when you pointed things out, is that you that was received with enough empathy that they were willing to make that change. And
Well,
it
you
feels
don't know
like
what
that.
you don't know.
Right,
You don't
right,
know what you don't know.
right.
So if no one says it out loud and you don't have anyone in the room who can say it out loud, you literally don't know it exists.
Yeah. Chris, we're in an interesting moment now in our world and in this country in particular, where it feels like so much of that is either missing or we just can't tap into it. Is that people aren't listening to one another, and people are defensing with one defensive. There's just so much division, and it feels like just empathy is gone, or at least that I don't hear it as much as I used to. What has happened, in the last several years or in this moment, and I'll just throw in there that there's this big backdrop of a pandemic that has killed so far close to 185,000 people in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
many more around the world, and so there is a global health crisis happening, and there is a culture. Uh, Revolution or change that's happening, or paradigm change in culture that's happening, and it just feels like just so many forces coming to one another, just converging. What is going on right now? And as somebody who studies culture, what's happening? What's going on?
I think we're living in the convergence of three really powerful forces. Three really powerful forces. Number one, I think that we are witnessing the death throes of a particular ideology, which I think is a scary and dangerous time to live in. Because the closer an organism gets to death, the harder it fights to live. And I think we are literally seeing the death of a particular strain of openly racist, openly sexist, openly classist, openly heterosexist ideology. I think
Wait,
it's,
you're saying we're starting to see the death of that?
yeah, I think it's dying. And
Really?
I think that the more it gets, the closer it gets to death, the more outward and violent and awful it is. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, because it's dying. And so every day, an old school racist, sexist, heterosexist is dying, literally, like physically gonna die, and they're gonna be replaced by your 5-year-old daughter who is none of those things.
Mhm.
And as that ideology is dying out, and this is not the first time this has happened. We can go back through history and look at the touch points of where particular kinds of ideologies died, and we can see the violence inherent in that system at that particular moment. We can do that historically. We can do it over and over and over again. I think we're hitting one of those walls right now, and I think that's a really scary and dangerous time to live in, because a lot of the people who hold that ideology are in power and are able to institutionalize that power on their way out the door. That's why I think these elections are so important. They're not important for, like, the election of Donald Trump wasn't important for Donald Trump. Donald Trump really doesn't have that much effect on the entire system, except that he got to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices who are there for the rest of their life. And that was scarier than him being in office at all. So it's the way that they're able to, and has changed the judges, who also get lifetime appointments throughout the country, and has done all of these things to change not your daily life, but to change the institutionalized structure of power in this country as a whole, which is then going to bleed into every part of your life for literally the rest of your life. So the fact that those people are in power as their ideology is dying, and they're able to sort of replicate and institutionalize it for this next period of time, that's the scary part. So that's one thing we're living through. I think the second thing we're living through is the fact that anyone with one of these and an internet connection is a media producer. And so the mechanisms that we had to vet the distribution of information in this country have completely dissolved. It used to be if you held a fringe ideology, if you were a QAnon believer, if you were a, you know, if you were one of these no maskers, if you were one of these people, you would have to be that in the privacy of your own home, and the people who knew you in your regular life would just avoid talking to you, and you would just be just one person saying really ignorant stuff to nobody. But the internet has changed that completely. Social media have changed that completely. The cell phone technology has changed that completely. So now there's a greater opportunity for those fringe beliefs to coalesce and to congregate and to believe that they're a bigger part of the population than they actually are, that they're more influential than they actually are, and that they are able to disseminate their ideologies to each other in ways that are frankly really dangerous for the rest of us, with much greater efficiency. And that's also terrifying. And then I think the third thing that we're dealing with is the fact that we have, particularly in this country, we've lost our sense of shame. I feel like people are no longer embarrassed to be racist. People are no longer embarrassed to be sexist. People are no longer embarrassed to be isolationist or to be xenophobic. And I really, really cannot wait until we're back to a place where those particular kinds of opinions have social consequence. And sadly, I think that, you know, this is a blame Obama moment, and not blame Obama in that it's his fault, but blame his very existence. Because him becoming president was fantastic for lots of people, but for this one dying ideology who now has complete power to disseminate their ideology to other people and to coalesce and to congregate, the third piece of that is now there is no shame for them in being that, because the president is also that. And that's just a swirling vortex of terrible for those of us who, you know, would like to see, I mean, we're trying to have a civilization over here. And this swirling vortex of awful is making that really difficult at this historical moment.
So everything that you described could easily be a script to a superhero movie, because you're describing, at least through one lens, it's you know, there's a superhero, there are people who are affected, there's a villain or villains.
We need a hero to arise at this moment like never before. One girl in all the world chosen to defend the rest of us from. You know,
all right, bring them on.
Right.
I've said to the issues that you speak with, especially about the rise of pride in expressing one's prejudice and racism, as no longer trying to explain yourself away from it, but to actually just own it and say, yes, I want those particular people of a particular skin color or ethnicity, whatever, out of my way, or I don't want them into the country, or
Mm-hmm.
so that point of view and this rise, I've often said it's actually good that it's coming out, because at least now we're dealing with it. So perhaps what you're saying, as you know, we no longer are seeing or observing this shame in one's prejudice and racism. I've said many times that it's actually good, because at least now we can deal with it, we can identify it, rather than having a more politically correct environment where everything is just under the blanket, if you will, and underneath. So in a way, this is helping us address the problem, perhaps, or maybe eventually get to addressing the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is sort of a, you know, better the devil you know kind of an attitude about it, right? I mean, sure, but the downside of that is that it's effing exhausting to live in that environment. Like, it's just plain exhausting to have to constantly, as a person who walks around all day in brown skin, you know, it's exhausting to have to wonder, is today the day where racists are this much more emboldened to actually do something to me or to my kid as she's walking around, you know, or to my wife, to my family. That's an exhausting. So, you know, I mean, at least when it wasn't so open and so blatant, you know, you could occasionally from day to day forget it's there. There's no forgetting it's there anymore. It's there, and it's there all the time, and people are proud of it being there. I actually do kind of like, you know, for example, the Trump Pence signs in people's yards. I like that because it's a really clear indication of that I don't want to talk to you. So that part has been, you know, really helpful, but in a very real way, it's just exhausting. That's what I feel most of the time. People are like, how do you feel about all this stuff? And I'm like, tired. I feel tired.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
Yeah. No, I can empathize, and I understand that, and it's not just from a political perspective. It's also from a personal safety perspective, or a self-worth perspective, and even when, you know, what we started talking with about kids seeing themselves in the toys that they play with and the superheroes that they look up to, and the characters that are played out there, also for them to see themselves in the superpowers, you know, the superheroes that hold positions of powers in this world. So when, you know, in preparation for this conversation, as I was thinking about the superhero theme, I wasn't only thinking about characters in comic books and movies. I was thinking of the role models that are in positions of power, the election of a black man as president, and what that did to an entire generation of black and brown kids in the United States who could finally see themselves as potentially holding positions of power. Because we're really, when we talk about superheroes, we're really talking about power, ability,
Influence.
and influence. And I remember, I mean, I'll just share with you a personal experience. I remember the moment, actually, since we brought up Obama's election, that moment had a lot of interesting things happening. I mean, I saw a lot of things in American culture at that point that a little bit surprised me, but also I just realized there are just elements that I never knew existed. So I'll share with you that one of the accusations that were thrown at this black man, agree or disagree with him politically, but just thrown at him, and it was an accusation, it was an allegation, is that he was Muslim. You know, that people were saying he was Muslim, as if that was a negative thing, you know, and as somebody who is Muslim, who has a Muslim family, who has Muslim kids, who are watching that, immediately they were hearing in that message for my own children that, or apparently it's a negative thing to be that, you know, like, so apparently, because if he, and even the defense against that from the Democratic Party was not, so what, you know, maybe he is, maybe he isn't.
Right?
It was, no, he isn't. He's a decent man. He's a good guy.
Right. He's not Muslim. He's decent. You're absolutely right.
He's a great guy. And I remember hearing that at that time, and I'm thinking, like, what message are we sending to an entire crowd of people who live in this country, and of kids who are looking up to this moment? On one hand, they're seeing themselves as the superhero, but on the other, there are a lot of other kids who started to see that, but if the allegation is correct, then that's not good. Then he couldn't be president, and that means that I couldn't be that superhero. And it was a really interesting moment. That was the defense, even from the people in his own party, is defending, no, he isn't. While the answer really should have been, well, he says he isn't, but it really shouldn't matter, you know,
Right.
because it's so what if he is? That's not necessarily a negative thing. These are things that have a huge impact on kids and on their self-worth and what they grow up thinking of themselves, and how they design their own lives, how they figure out who they become, what type, if they become a superhero, if they choose to, or it's the self-worth and the confidence that they have that they can be powerful people in their own way, and however that looks. and all of a sudden we start to see like this entire comic book that's playing out in our lives and
Yeah.
impacting everybody. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's really important and valuable. I mean, one of the things that one of the key components, particularly of our culture, of American culture, is the way that it systematically discourages and punishes you if you're the kind of person who asks questions, especially if you ask very specific kinds of questions. This culture doesn't want you to do that. And when you start asking questions about things that people love, when you start asking questions about popular culture, when you start asking questions about superheroes and the impact that maybe that might have on kids or TV shows or whatever, what you will get in response from a large swath of people is, well, it's just entertainment. Why are you you're reading too much into it, and why don't you just let us like stuff, and why are you trying to ruin things, and blah, blah, blah. But really, the underlying factor of that is, why are you trying to make me think about things that I've been socially conditioned to not think about? Why does it matter? It matters because children process differently than adults, and I cannot stress that enough. Children process differently than adults. Mm-hmm. So when you have these narratives that, you know, the president might be Muslim and that might be bad or whatever, your kid is not going to look at you and say, Daddy, please explain that to me. They're not going to do that. They're going to look to you and they're going to see how you react to that. They're going to see what you have to say about that. They're going to see what your thought processes are about that. They're going to internalize that. It's going to manifest in their play, and it's going to manifest in the way that they interact with other kids that they are in contact with. You're not going to see what's bubbling under the surface of that. You're not. And so the way that we react to these situations, the way that we combat these situations, the way that we talk about people really does reflect onto our children. It really does. And I think that's why it's so important that we, again, first world problem, sure, but that the representations that we have in the media that we consume are actually representative of people and their real lived experiences. Because you're right, there's this moment, there's this crystallization moment when Obama gets elected where some Black people were like, you know, finally here's this moment, we've arrived, we've got this going on, whatever. And where some white people were like, the world that we knew was over, it's over now. And those things then translated into their children who came of age under Obama, who then were able to vote in the next election. And that messaging had profound impact on how those people voted. Had profound impact. If you go and you look at the voting in 2016, if you go to look to 2016 election and you look at the 18 to 24-year-old voting bloc, you will see some very interesting trends. You'll see some very interesting trends.
Like what? Like so yeah.
Based
like
based on them growing up under Obama and hearing for the last, 8 years, one of these two narratives.
Oh, I see.
Either this was really great for the country, or this was really terrible for the country. Yeah. And Obama was either a superhero or a supervillain, depending on what kind of a household you lived in, and people voted accordingly. Young people voted accordingly.
So as somebody who studies culture and more specifically how superheroes are represented, let's talk a little bit about that. How can someone be a superhero to some and a supervillain to others, and it's the same character? How can Black Panther be seen as a superhero, but then there are other people who see him as a supervillain, or pick your superhero of choice. That
I'll
would
I'll
that would be
stick
an
in your
interesting
same
topic
movie.
to deconstruct.
I'll stick in your same movie. Let's not talk about T'Challa because T'Challa's easy. Let's talk about Eric Killmonger.
Okay.
Because Killmonger is the villain for Black Panther, except that he's not. Killmonger is portrayed in the film as the villain. I actually think Ulysses Klaue is the villain, and Klaue, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Black Panther, Klaue dies 45 minutes into the movie. And the rest of the movie is a movie without a villain. Killmonger is not a villain. He is the victim. He is the victim of the story. He is a person who was abandoned, whose father was killed by a particular system that then purposefully locked him out. He was left to his own devices. He has legitimate anger, legitimate rage, legitimate beef against Wakanda and its entire system of being. He is not a villain in a vacuum. He's not a mustache twirler. He's not a bad guy. He is the direct result of a particular ideology that made him. So for some people watching that movie, they're like, oh, well, clearly he's the villain because he kills people and he, beats T'Challa and he wants to. What is Killmonger's plot? Killmonger's plot is not to murder everyone and take over. Killmonger's plot is to arm Black people against a system that has ritually oppressed them forever. That's his plot in the movie. And if you as a person with brown skin are watching that and you don't have at least this much of you that's like, yeah, actually, why don't we do that? I don't know what I don't know what, I can't get my brain around that framework, around that mental framework. I can't. Killmonger has a legitimate point. His execution, the way he goes about it, his ultimate plan or whatever, I think this is part of the reason why this film is so rich. It's such a rich text, is because what we come to think of as villainy is really on trial in this movie. It's really on trial. Killmonger's storyline is actually a story of accountability. Story of accountability. That's why in the end, T'Challa says, you were wrong to his father. You were all wrong. All of you hid Wakanda away from the world. You killed your own brother and left his son to die on his own to fend for himself. And you were wrong about that. That's a redemption story. Killmonger is redeemed in the end of that film. His last line is, bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who knew it was better to die than to live in bondage. That is not the death speech of a supervillain. It's not. And I find it such a fascinating text.
What do you make of the representation in the movie of cultures as villain cultures versus superhero cultures? That the Black culture that was represented as a superhero culture was African. I'll use the word pure African, if you will. Like, so they had not. It's not African American, and then what was represented as the villain culture, if you will, or as a culture that had flaws, was African American. And it's kind of like putting these two worlds against one another. And I know that there were even articles at that time when the movie came out that criticized that. What do you think of that whole representation? It sounds like you just touched on it a little bit.
And I think I do think there's some validity to that, but I also think that that the piece of that that's missing is that the demonized culture in that film is not the culture of African Americans. It's the culture of America as colonizer. And I think that, yes, Eric Killmonger being this Black American who comes to pure Africa as a bad guy is problematic, but only if you don't then take the next step to step out to see that actually throughout the film, Americans in general are the bad guy. Like American culture as a whole is the thing that they are pushing back against in this film. This colonization culture that takes and does not. I mean, even if you wait until the after credit scene, you know, where T'Challa comes out and presents himself to the world, and then the first thing someone says is, "What can a nation of goat herders offer the rest of the world?" Right? I mean, that mentality does pervade American culture. It does. And as a colonized people within American culture, Black people are also subject to that. We just are. You know, there is a legitimate tension between African Americans and Africans. There is a legitimate tension there. And I think not shying away from it, not pushing back from it, but actually legitimizing it and saying this is real. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, and perhaps what came out a little bit in the movie is a representation of Blackness without the stain of slavery on it, and without the stain of history on it. That this is like, this is what Black society looks like, or would look like, or if it wasn't completely destroyed by kidnapping Black people from their land and chaining them and taking them as slaves.
Which will take us back to one of the very first thing I said, which is the only way we get that is Ryan Coogler. The only way we get that is Black writer, Black director, Black producer. It's the only way we get that story. Because when you look at the comic book version of this story, it reads very differently. And it reads very differently because Black Panther was created by two white guys in New York City who were Jewish, who were in many ways afraid of Black people. If you look at the X-Men, if you look at Black Panther in its first inception, I mean, two issues into Black Panther, they have to change his name because people start to identify him with the Black Panther Party, because the text comes out in the late 1960s. And they actually back away from that for a few issues before coming back into it and being okay with it. But they were actually afraid of that connection, and they backed off of it. They made him change his name for a couple of issues. When you read the original text, for example, M'Baku, in the comic book, he is the man ape. And he is literally like a human gorilla in that text. And it was really clever how Ryan Coogler took this incredibly racist character and reworked him for the film into one of the most beloved parts of that film. People love M'Baku now, but if you love M'Baku and you go back to read Black Panther, you are going to find M'Baku comes from a very racist origin, very racist beginnings, right? Because when the Black Panther text started in the 1960s, it didn't start from Black people trying to make sense of the world. It started from white people trying to make sense of Black people, which is always a dicey territory. So the fact that this film gets made and then it gets made by a Black writer, by a Black director, fundamentally changes the nature of the story and therefore presents a different narrative. Much like, you know, the Wonder Woman films of the past were dwarfed by the Wonder Woman film now because Patty Jenkins is a woman taking the story in a completely different direction, and it's better than any other Wonder Woman text we've gotten before that. So who gets to tell those stories matters immensely.
What are the nuances that maybe the average person has missed in the Wonder Woman transformation from the past to the present movie? Like how is it so different from the past ones?
So Wonder Woman in her original conception is a male fantasy story. So Wonder Woman's first texts come out in the 1940s. If you look at the original issue 1 Wonder Woman, she is basically a pinup girl, in the same way that you would see pinup girls painted on the sides of like bombers and that kind of stuff during World War II. She is a very she's got her hair in the pinup rolls. She is, you know, very scantily clad for the 1940s. She has she is a dominatrix, because very well documented. The man who created Wonder Woman was into S&M and bondage kinds of stuff, and so she has a lot of those same traits in her appearance and in her powers. I mean, she literally has bracelets, which are analogs for handcuffs. She's got the bustier and the boots and the rope that makes you tell the truth. Like, there's a lot of bondage metaphors tied up in her original conception. And she was definitely created for boys and men, because in the 1940s and 1950s, comic books, particularly adventure and hero comic books, were specifically targeted towards boys and men. So Wonder Woman was not created as a female superhero for women. She was created as a female superhero fantasy for boys and men. And that was her entire existence for really the first, 40, 50 years of her existence. She gets a little bit of a repackage in the 1970s. She gets a little bit of a repackage in the 1980s. By the time the 2000s hit, she is definitely more of a feminist sort of icon, at least in the comic book texts. And then, we get a lot of Wonder Woman starts and stops. There was a really famous Wonder Woman script written by Joss Whedon that does not get made, which has a real Buffy sensibility about it, but they don't actually make that script. So that by the time we end up with Patty Jenkins, she has changed fundamentally the nature of Wonder Woman versus the other characters in the text. There's a real fleshing out, for example, of Themyscira, of the Amazons as a people, of why they're there and what their culture is like. There's a real there's a racialization of Themyscira that did not happen in the past, where we get more kinds of women on that island. Her relationship to Steve is changed significantly. It's one of my actual favorite parts of the Wonder Woman movie, is that Steve does all the things that the female character would normally do in a superhero story. He is marginalized in exactly the same way that the female love interest is marginalized in every other superhero text, which is kind of a really clever slap in the face of the normal superhero text. It is just a very, I would put the scene where Wonder Woman grabs the shield and is assaulting the tower and the bullets are flying and she's got the pop, that I would put that sort of 30-second sequence up against any superhero sequence in any superhero movie I've ever seen, in terms of its power, in terms of its agency, in terms of the way that Wonder Woman gets to be strong, and not necessarily as sexualized. And I say not necessarily because all superheroes are sexualized to some extent, male and female. Sexuality is a part of. I mean, yeah, like it or not, Wonder Woman is Wonder Woman because she looks like Gal Gadot. I mean, that's just the nature of it. But Daredevil is Daredevil because he looks like Charlie Cox. I mean, there is a sexualization that that happens no matter what superhero you are. I hear enough about Tom Holland from my 14-year-old to really last me the rest of my life. So it's like that being physically attractive is part and parcel of superhero texts in general. So I hesitate to call that endemic to the Wonder Woman text. But yeah, I think I do think that Patty Jenkins has done some really interesting. I'm very excited to see 1984, Wonder Woman 1984, which is the sequel, which is coming out later this year. I'm very excited to see that, because I'm hoping that she's able to continue to do the kinds of things that she was able to do in the first one. So yeah.
Have there been a woman of color as superhero, or maybe
That's an interesting story, and the answer is, of course there are. And more and more and more in the coming days, right? I mean,
Mm.
it, there's at least in terms of film, we've had Storm for quite some time in the X-Men stories. Even dating all the way back to the 60s with Eartha Kitt as Catwoman, right? And then revamped into the frankly kind of terrible Halle Berry Catwoman movie, right? But you've also got, in the Luke Cage stories, you've got Misty Knight, who is basically kind of a Jackie Brown analog. More so in the text, more so in the comic books than she was in the film. But she has been around for a very long time. We've had lots of Asian female superheroes, everyone from Jubilee, whose real name is Jubilation Lee. She's a Chinese American sort of young superhero. So we've had her for a while. We've had the actual Captain Marvel. I get into this fight all the time about Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel for me is not blonde hair, blue-eyed Carol Danvers. Captain Marvel for me is Monica Rambeau. She's the original Captain Marvel. She was Captain Marvel during Marvel's Secret Wars in 1984, which is the seminal text for Marvel, I feel like, for an entire generation. She was on the cover of the first issue of that. So she is the real Captain Marvel as far as I am concerned. And she has been around for a very long time. So, I mean, yeah, we have had a series of women of color who are superheroes. But most of the time, those superheroes are attached to other things. They're attached to other texts. Monica Rambeau is an Avenger. Storm is an X-Man. Jubilee is an X-Man. So they're always a part of a team. We don't really get a whole lot of standalone women of color as superheroes, which is part and parcel of the fact that we have a lot of white people writing comic books. It's still today, there's a lot of white people writing comic books. So I do think that's definitely it's definitely an area to continue to look into.
This is really fascinating. I just a quick question about Avatar. Have you seen? I take it you've seen Avatar. You've seen every movie, probably, right?
Which Avatar? Avatar Blue Cat People Avatar or Avatar Last Airbender Avatar? Because the answer is yes. I've seen them both.
Blue Cat People Avatar.
Okay.
That movie drove me nuts.
Oh yeah. Because
it's a white fantasy film. And there are just so many things that probably are so wrong with it, but I'll tell you, like, the one thing that just drove me absolutely batty was that you have all these people who have done the things that they do for, I don't know, thousands of years, and then you have white men coming in and taking on the suit, if you will, of them, and then becomes the hero and the savior of an entire.
It's a literal white fantasy film. We make this movie over and over and over again in this culture. White person. The movie starts with a white person in Whiteville, where they are in their own universe, where they are somehow an outsider. They're somehow problematic, whatever. And then they are sort of either forcefully or coercively exiled to a brown community. They come into this community has problems, they can't solve on their own, they've been trying forever, whatever. The white person comes in, they don't want to be noticed, they don't want to be seen, they want to sit in the background. But of course the brown people are like, oh no, clearly you are superior to us in every way, and we have to elevate you to this position of power. You become our leader, and not only are you our leader, you're the greatest leader we've ever had, and you're the only person who can solve our problems. And then that person does do that. And oftentimes the people they are up against are white society in general, so that we feel as though they really are uplifting this brown community against white people. And they fight, and then at the end of the film they have to choose, do I go back to this white community or do I stay here with the brown people? And they always choose to stay here with the brown people as the greatest person they've ever met. In the movie, she tells Jake Sully, she's like, in the entire history of our planet, there's only ever been 3 Tarak Makto. 3 people who could ride the Tarak Makto in our entire history of our planet. And that dude is Tarak Makto inside of like 3 weeks. Like, it's the whole film is patently ridiculous. And it's not just Avatar. You can see that movie in Freedom Riders. You could see that movie in Dangerous Minds. You could see that movie in The Pianist. You can see that movie over and over and over again because we love that movie in this culture. And by we, I mean white folks. We love that
Yeah.
movie in this culture. And we will make that movie over and over and over again because it reinforces the idea that white people get to play savior to brown communities because brown communities can't do it on their own. And then that also gets internalized into brown communities, that brown communities then wait for white people to save them from whatever is happening. We make this movie over and over and over again, and then we wonder why black people don't evacuate during Hurricane Katrina. Like, like it has bleed over effect into our actual culture. We need to stop making that movie. We need to stop making that movie.
And it does have bleed over effect over how people pursue education, pursue careers, see
All
themselves,
of the above.
design their lives, figure out what they want to do. You know, go to college, get degrees, just see themselves in different roles. I mean, I had this epiphany the other day as I'm hearing my 5-year-old, that's my youngest child, talk about who she wants to be when she grows up. And you know, and one of my things is that I never ask anyone, what do you want to do when you grow up? Because I think it's a ridiculous question. But so I wondered where she got it from, first of all. But anyway, she started talking about it, and it's literally just the roles that she has seen in books or in TV or things like that, you know. So she's talking about the standard things. It's police officer, doctor, you know, those things. And when I started to say, like, if our kids are only exposed to this type of crap out of movies, then this is the type of self-worth that they're going to develop over time. And and one movie might not have the huge impact that we think, but 2, 3, 10 movies, comic books, etc., all of these things are going to have that huge impact. That movie. So Avatar, I think the first time I saw a movie that had the same impact on me as Avatar did was Tarzan. Remember Tarzan?
Oh yeah.
I'm like, what is this white dude, you know, just in the jungle killing lions and whatever? When you have, like, you know, people who are of that land, who have been there for millions of years, who don't do the things that he does. And it comes back. What it takes me back is really to the issue of power, of self-worth, of self-confidence, and how, you know, how we see our future and how we see ourselves in
Well,
the future.
absolutely. And that power aspect is so important. It's the thing people discount, right? Because what will happen is, you know, someone like me will say, well, here's all this stuff and we should change it. And then someone will say, oh, but this is what sells. It's fine. It's business. It's not about the production. It's about what sells. It's about what people want. But that presumes that people have an option as to what it is they want to buy. You know, we have lots and lots of consumer choice, but we have almost no consumer control. It's a real stick or brick proposition. As I tell my students all the time, it's a stick or brick proposition. If I walked up to you and I say, hey man, I got a stick in this hand and I got a brick in this hand, which one do you want me to hit you with? Have I gave you a choice? I mean, really, have I given you a choice? And that's the way our media consumption is. So when people go, oh, well, they make this stuff because that's what people will buy, it's not like they make that stuff in a vacuum. It's not like they make that stuff out of nowhere. We are given very specific choices, and then they go, this is what people will buy, because they haven't tried to sell them anything else. And when you do try to sell them something else, they do buy it. Someone in the comments was talking about Doc McStuffins is huge with her toddlers. You know why Doc McStuffins is huge with her toddlers? Because it's a really good show about a black doctor and a little kid who wants to be a black doctor. And you hadn't ever seen that before, so no one knew someone would buy it. And when they put it on the television, guess what? People bought it. And not just brown people, white people too. Why? Because it's a really good show. But if we don't know, then we don't know. So this whole idea of like, oh, it's a business and this is what people will buy, that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. You don't know what people will buy until you give it to them. And what you're doing is just replicating what has been useful for you to make money in the past. That's not innovation. That's not originality. That's just preserving your own power. That's just preserving your own power base. That response, that this is business response, to me is never valid. It's never, I don't consider it at all. When I hear someone say that, what I know is they don't want to engage in an actual discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Chris, I think this has been just an insightful conversation. I could go on for another couple of hours just talking about comic books and characters with you, and I love the analysis that you bring into this. One image, if you could describe the future in one image, what would that be?
If
We'll
I could
finish with
describe
that
the
question.
future in one image,
Yeah,
hmm.
maybe it's the image right behind you. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think if I could describe the future in one image, it might be. Stand by. I'm going to do it for you.
Oh, you're gonna put it up.
Yeah.
I love it.
Um, if I could describe the future in one image, it would look like this. Um,
So while you look for
yeah,
it, Chris,
yeah, keep going, and then I'll show you.
I'll describe to you mine. I actually, but based on the conversation you had now, I just feel like it's an entire field of leaders from different backgrounds in a variety of areas. Like it's the representation you were talking about earlier that I want to see presidents of universities and leaders of companies and people in positions of influence, superheroes. That represent all walks of life, that represent people of color, of different ethnicities, different genders, um, um, different physical abilities or disability in general that's represented. Um, and that all of these characters are represented as people of certain influence or power or authority. That they're not always just the receiver of help, but that they are the masters of their own destiny. So I think the summary of this conversation is representation.
Yeah,
That's what I want to see. All
this
right.
is what my future looks like.
So describe it. What is this? This
This
is
is Shuri.
yeah.
Um, Black Panther Shuri. That's what my future looks like. Um, I think that there's something really, really powerful in Marvel canonizing that Shuri is the smartest person on the planet.
Yeah.
Um, Literally. And the smartest person on the planet is a black African woman, young black African woman. And how do we know they canonized that? Because in Avengers, in the Endgame series, the two smartest people on the planet previously, i.e., uh, Tony Stark and Bruce Banner, go to Shuri for advice because Shuri has figured out a thing that they can't figure out.
Oh.
That's the future to me. The
So
future
you
to
think
me.
you think that's gonna happen? That's gonna be the 2022 Black
I don't know
Panther
if it's
movie?
2022 or if it's 2032 or whatever, but the future of brown women uh, who have a legacy of millennia of taking care of people are I think the key
Yeah.
to the rest of the
Yeah.
rest of the world.
Well, you're certainly in a position of influence to potentially help us make this happen. So, so if anyone could do it, it's you. So, talk some sense into these people, and keep doing what you're doing. I love everything that you do and everything that you stand for.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Chris, for spending the time today.
Before we
You
go
clear,
though, there's
yeah.
a really important question in the Q&A, and I want to answer it. I don't want to leave this.
All right,
Someone
real
wrote
quick.
someone wrote if white people are to be allies, then shouldn't they stand up for minorities and use their white privilege power to empower people of color? I recognize there are issues with needing a white savior as the focus, but the two ideas have always felt a little contradictory. How can white people help without becoming the superhero? I'm going to give you a superhero phrase right now that you can use that will end this conversation, that will end that question for you. It's really
Yeah.
two questions, and it looks like this. What do you need, and how can I help?
Mm.
What do you need and how can I help? That's the difference. The difference isn't me coming in and being like, I'm going to do this for you. And here I'm uplifting this community and let me do all this stuff. The issue is coming into brown communities, coming into situations about and using your white privilege, using your power for good. And how do you do that? By talking to the people that you're trying to uplift, by going into those communities and saying, what do you need and how can I help? I think if
Yeah.
more white people learned how to do that, we would be in a better space.
I think
But it
that's a
doesn't become
beautiful
a white savior narrative. It becomes you joining a community to help on their terms, not on yours.
Yeah. If I may, I want to add one thing to it because this is out of personal experiences I've had, and it is to stand up for what it's right, when it's most inconvenient for you as a
Exactly.
person of privilege. So, when you feel like there's a lot that you're gonna put on the line, whether it's your business or your reputation with your community or relationships or just how people look at you, when you feel like, yeah, like that's maybe I'll just do that in private. I actually would want, like, if you really want to be a true ally, is actually unconditionally putting yourself out there in support of the underprivileged community when it's most inconvenient for you, not convenient. And the reason I say this is because sometimes it feels like when it's most convenient, that's when we start to see all of these statements and posts on social media in support, because now it's in vogue to be for
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter or for kneeling or whatever. But I needed you to be for that, and I needed you to kneel when it was not popular to kneel
Yeah.
in support of Black Lives Matter. When Kaepernick lost his job as a result of that, that's when, as a white person, I needed you to say it unequivocally, like absolutely unconditionally. I feel like you needed to stand up there and potentially lose something out of it because you're standing up for what is right and you get what this is for, and not just trying to walk the thin line and saying, well, both sides have an argument. There are no both sides.
There are no both.
Right.
In racism, there are no both sides.
No, there's right and there's wrong, and I need you to be on the right side when it's inconvenient for you. So I love what you said, and I just wanted to add this
Yeah.
to it. Is
I
in
completely
addition,
agree. Don't just stand up for me to my face. Turn
yeah,
around and stand up for me to your friends. Like,
yeah,
stand up for me at Thanksgiving dinner. Don't out here in the street is great, but that's not where change is made. Where change is made is around your dinner table. So start there.
start there, and then that's like, to tie it to the superhero theme. Like there are places where you can be the superhero, and it's when it's most the riskiest, if you will, for you and where you're standing. And I don't mean physical risk. Obviously, I don't want to say that you put yourself literally in harm's way,
Right.
but that you actually do suffer some consequences out of that. Like when you feel like there will be some negative consequences on your reputation, your business, or by the way, your politics, that you might lose votes because you're standing up for its right. That's when I need you to actually say it. Not once you step out of office and you write a book and then you
Right.
come and speak at a national convention.
Right.
That doesn't do me any good. I need you to say it when you're in office and you might actually lose some white votes.
Right.
Then I might actually be willing to give you the label of superhero, because that was pretty brave, what you just did. So it's been a fascinating conversation. I wish we could
Yeah.
go on, but we're already 10 minutes over.
All
I want to
right.
remind.
We'll pull it back.
I want to. So there's a thing I always say at the end of every Vision Chats, and I'll say it again. And I think it's really relevant. There's only one certain vision for the future, and it's the one that you create. So go on, everybody, and create it. And you create your superheroes, create your narratives. Make sure that we have diverse perspectives at the table, and keep fighting what it's right. Chris, you're awesome. I want to do this again.
Thanks, man. Anytime. Anytime you
Yeah.
want me back, I'm back.
Hope we can connect again soon. Wish you all the very best, and talk again soon. Bye-bye.